So just a brief history, because it didn't start with Janet Travell. There was this guy, Bayeux, in the 1500s, who described muscle pain syndromes. And then this other doctor in England in 1816 observed nodular tumors and thickenings which were painful to the touch and from which pains shot to neighboring parts. So humans are the same everywhere, and you know, high IQ humans existed hundreds of years ago too, and they were able to figure out a lot of stuff on their own. So it wasn't like we just gotten so much smarter. If you pay attention to the news, you know we're not that smart. But there were smart people hundreds of years ago who were finding these things. 1938, Jonas Kellgren studied and published referred pain patterns using saline injections. I mentioned him. He would inject his interns, his students, to study pain referral patterns. And that saline would reproduce the same myofascial pain referrals that we know today from Dr. Travell. And so he influenced Cyriax in England and Travell in the US. And then Travell started studying Kellgren on cardiac pain, because she was a cardiology resident in a New York hospital, and she more than once saw people come in with heart attack that wasn't a heart attack. It was myofascial pain that made it feel to the person like they were having a heart attack. That may have even included that atrial fibrillation type thing that we know from those pectoralis trigger points. So it got her interested in this, and she started studying musculoskeletal pain. And then she and Rinzler published an article on the diagnosis and treatment of muscle pain. They observed that fascia also referred pain, so they changed the term to myofascial pain. And then Steindler introduced the term trigger point in 1940. And then Travell and Simons introduced myofascial trigger point, myofascial pain syndrome as terminologies. And then Carl Levitt put out his needle effect paper in 1979 and called it dry needling, because he said it wasn't the injectate that made the pain go away, it was the needle. So he kind of demonstrated for people that they didn't need to be injecting procaine or lidocaine into trigger points. They could just use an acupuncture needle to release the trigger point. And Carl Levitt was a big fan of acupuncture, and in his books he even writes that he hopes in the future more acupuncturists will take a more anatomical approach to acupuncture, because he feels like if they did, it could be like the first line of treatment for most pain patients. That first they should be getting acupuncture before they get anything more invasive. So nobody even paid attention to him, but he was always a fan of acupuncture. And then 77 Melzack compared 48 trigger points to acupuncture points and found that there was 100% correlation. Different studies found 70 to 90% overlap. You probably heard of overlap of motor points and acupuncture points too. There does seem to be some correlation to where the nerve innervates the muscle and where acupuncture points eventually were most selected. And it kind of makes sense, because the fascia research shows that the nerves and vessels pierce our fascia. So there's little holes in the fascia where the vessels can pass through and the nerves can pass through. And the fascia research shows that stimulation of the fascia with light touch, vibration, pressure has a beneficial effect on the autonomic nervous system, putting people into a more parasympathetic state. So if you choose a spot that has this higher level of innervation and vascular blood circulation, you're very likely having a more beneficial effect on the whole nervous system, which is, I believe, what makes acupuncture, traditional acupuncture, so effective for so many things. The things that it works best on are the things that are made worse by stress. fertility, insomnia, digestive issues, immunity, everything that stress can make worse, acupuncture, traditional acupuncture can make better. So hyperirritable spot in skeletal muscle that's associated with hypersensitive palpable nodule in a taut band. So the taut band is such a good terminology because I think trigger point, I think something round. And trigger points are not round. They're not knots, and knots with a K, and they're not points. They're taut bands. So we're always palpating for taut bands. They're going to be long, ropey bands. And some people have a theory of needling cross fiber on the taut bands to get them to fire better. And I personally tend to needle with the fiber of the band most of the time to avoid unnecessary tissue damage on both sides of the taut band. And it works that way too. So sometimes you'll do cross fiber. One good example would be when you have multiple taut bands in the infraspinatus, sometimes you just run the needle cross fiber through all of them and get them all firing and released. But when you're working in the upper trapezius, your safe angles are going to be into the taut bands, medial to lateral, and not going perpendicularly. Though sometimes you can do it safely. So diagnosis and research. Diagnosis, palpation, flat fingers, perpendicular to muscle fibers, and pincer palpation. So a lot of palpation of trigger points is cross fiber with the flat finger. The best way to feel it is with the pad of your finger. And then the challenge for trigger point theories is that there's no objective test. It relies on palpation for diagnosis and post-treatment exam. And the location relies on the skill of the examiner. Trigger points don't really show up on an MRI or a CT scan or an X-ray. So it's hard to do unbiased research because whether the trigger point is the correct part of the trigger point is located and treated relies entirely on the skill of the person doing it. So if you were to do trigger point research and you just hired a bunch of interns that you're going to pay $20 an hour and they didn't know anything about trigger points, palpation, or treatment, your research would show that because they would likely not find the active part of the trigger point and they probably wouldn't release it fully. They might even make it worse. So the skill of the practitioner is very, very important for location of the correct part of the trigger point and release of the trigger point. And that makes research really hard to do. You can't double blind it. So if you know J.P. Shaw, J-A-Y is the first name, P is the middle initial, Shaw is his last name. He does a lot of research in the US on trigger points. And he uses sonogram, vibration, sonoelastogram, and Doppler to try to visualize where the trigger points are. So he used Doppler ultrasound to show changes in microcirculation in and around the trigger point.